Hey everybody, I think we are live. I wish it was easier to tell. Or maybe I'm just not very good at this stuff. Anyway, I think we're live, and hey, we're doing a Paintover stream today. A little something different. I haven't done any Paintover critiques in quite a while, and I thought it'd be kind of fun. So I picked some pieces from the Discord server, and if you want to check that out, the link is in the description. And yeah, I'm just going to do some Paintovers and critiques, and hopefully be a good learning lesson. Even if your stuff isn't in here, I find it's still really useful to watch critiques. So if you have any questions as I go along and go through these, feel free to ask in the chat. I'm probably not going to look quite as much at the chat today as I do on the other ones, but I'll still try to keep an eye on it. I'm just going to try to see what I can do with these pieces. So this is cool. I really like this. First impression is very cool. One thing I'm noticing is there's a lot of stuff here that's really close to the edges. A lot of kind of focal points are just like slammed into the corners. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's perfectly fine to do that. But if most of your stuff is very close to the edge, it can almost feel a little scared. You can be it's almost like you're hesitating from putting stuff, in the center and stuff. So I'm gonna maybe move some stuff around first. So like this little dude in the corner, I like this little dude, but he's gonna get moved over a bit. So he's gonna actually come out a little bit so that we can really see him. Because I didn't actually spot him when I was looking at just the thumbnail for this piece. I had to zoom in before I actually noticed he was there. So I'm going to move him on in. And so he's going to be there now. And now that also lets us kind of silhouette him against the stuff behind it, these light values. And now he can pop a little bit more. So just a little thing, but I find that, getting it somewhere that you can really read that focal point. It will also help give scale to the whole scene, especially for something so ethereal and strange and a weird landscape. You got to have something to kind of latch on to at least get a general idea of the scale. So another thing I want to think about is perspective here. So based on this kind of ground here, it looks like the horizon line is going to be somewhere around here. Which is relevant because it means we're looking up at everything above this. You could also maybe say the horizon line's there instead, because there's some more like flat water line there. But regardless, it's quite a low horizon line. So we want to keep that in mind as we're working through the rest of the piece and make that clear. So I was originally confused about kind of this light strip here because I wasn't sure exactly what was happening in there. So I think I'm going to try to make this a little bit clearer, exactly what's going on there. So I actually want to bring in some of this dark sky color so that maybe we can see the sky poking through the bottom of these clouds, because I think that might start to help a little bit and clarify what's going down there with the values. And I might also darken down some of these light rocks and stuff. Something to keep in mind when I'm doing paintovers is this is sort of my solution to the problems. There's always a lot of ways to do a painting. There's a lot of ways to solve problems. And this is kind of just one solution to it, which is very helpful. It's part of why I like Paintovers, is that you get to see how somebody would solve that problem, but it's not necessarily the best way or the right way, and it's certainly not the only way. There's a lot of ways to work on paintings and a lot of ways to solve problems, and this is just sort of one way to do that. So just a little something to keep in mind. But overall, I really like this piece. I really like the strange, surreal, really liquid forms going on. I think it's really nice. I might try to work a little bit on these clouds right here, kind of on the edge of this form, because I feel like some of that, it isn't getting the roundness. So if you think about this cloud, you want to think, well, most of this is kind of flat plane back here. But then as we get to this edge, there actually is like a 3D like wrapping around. And so you want to emphasize that kind of stuff going on. It's where we get to see a lot of those cloud layers as they transform from this sort of top view only to actually wrapping around and starting to see the underside of them. And again, I might bring things in just a little bit more from the edge. I think you're a little too tight on the edge for some of this stuff. So I'm going to bring some stuff in just a little bit. That's one of those things that's a lot of personal choice. And composition's a weird one like that, where it's kind of up to you what you think looks good and right. A lot of the composition rules are kind of bullshit, and you can honestly do whatever it is that works in a piece, and they don't always adhere to the rules. So I'm not going to say that, oh, you need to put in like rule of thirds, that needs to be your focal point, because you kind of don't. You can, but it's definitely not the only place you can put a focal point. There's a lot of options, and I think that's, yeah, too often ignored. I wonder about maybe making this tree like really big. I don't know if this is a good idea or not yet, but I at least want to try. So it's going to change a lot, but I at least want to try it out and give you this kind of option for something. Because that's another thing that this piece is lacking. It's lacking any really big foreground shapes. And you're trying to go for this really huge scale, and you can't get that huge scale unless you've got stuff in the foreground to compare it to. It's one of the best tricks for getting scale in landscapes, is to have some stuff in the foreground that is sort of obscuring a lot of stuff, but is providing a lot of that depth that you want to get. So this is something I talk a lot about in Art Camp 3, where we're talking about landscapes, is the different ways to get depth and scale in your landscape work. And one of the big ones that a lot of people struggle with, myself included early on, is getting enough scale in your foreground. It's really hard, because the thing is that when you're painting a big landscape like this, you want to focus on the really cool, awesome, big stuff going on back here, and covering it all up with foreground stuff, it does not feel like what you want to be doing. You're so focused on the big stuff that you want to like leave enough room for it. But if you start looking at old masters and stuff, you realize that so much of their work is obscured. You'll see these massive foregrounds and just these huge trees obscuring everything, and then suddenly, poking through the trees, you have this huge landscape, and you have an overall feel looking at the piece that it's big and epic and sweeping, but it's such a small part of the piece is actually that big landscape. So that's another thing I think I'd keep in mind. So I honestly don't know that I'll do too much more to this piece. There's some other tweaks that I might consider, but I think these are kind of the high points of what I would think to look at. So let's yeah, there we go. So you can see I didn't change a lot, because I like the colors, I like the ethereal lighting, I like the kind of weird landscape forms, and I just wanted to push things a little bit closer to the middle, so that you get the full sense of scale and it makes the center of the composition a little bit more interesting and doesn't leave just all the interesting stuff on the far edge of the piece. So hopefully that makes sense. Is the Discord only for people who joined Art Camp? No, it is not. That is a different Discord. You do get access to a Discord if you join Art Camp, but that's a different one than the new one I've just started now. The new one I started now is much smaller, and it's just going to be a small paid Discord for people that are currently studying and want to hang out with other people that are currently studying. Let's see here. Cool. So I think we'll move on to the next one. All right, so doing some character stuff here. I will obviously preface, as always, that I'm not a character artist, but I will do my best to offer some guidance here. So the first thing I want to say is it's about values, and I think your values are pretty good, but I think they could use some work. There's a lot of places I like what you're doing with the values and the color, but I wonder if overall it's a strong enough read, because anytime I look at a piece, I zoom out like this, and it's not quite as punchy as I'd like it to be, and there's some odd contrast in places that I don't think need that much contrast. So I really like what you're doing with this like glow behind him, and I wonder about extending that. Because not only is it a pretty cool lighting effect, but it also lets you silhouette the bottom of his figure a little bit better and let us see some of that detail down there. And then I also wonder about adding in some more darks throughout the figure, because you do have some darks here, but if you look at the overall piece, the thing that really stands out is the wheel, because the wheel is this really dark value on this really light value behind it, whereas the figure is not quite as strong value-wise. And so I think you might consider doing some more of that. So you can bring in some more darks into the figure, and that's one of the things I do. So in the really dark areas where folds are meeting and stuff, start to bring in some really dark values, and you can even play it up with a little bit of line work or something. Start to get in those like super deep values. Because if you were going to go like kind of light and pastel with the whole piece, that would be fine. So you could also go the other way and keep the figure more or less how they are, but then lighten that wheel some, and that would also probably work. But I think they're not working in relation to one another. Another thing I might say is some of the fabric folds. They're feeling a little squishy in places, and I think you need some more, there's some more like straight lines going on, so that they can provide some structure to this. So I almost wonder about simplifying some of the fabric and removing some of those folds, because I don't think they're doing much for you. Another thing I might think about is emphasizing the perspective. So we're looking up at this figure, so I would find ways to take some of these lines and fabric details and really emphasize some of those curves so that we can show that underlying form. Because especially some of the bottom seems to be flattening out a bit. So as we get to the lower stuff, really emphasizing some of those cylindrical shapes looking down at it. So I wonder about getting a little bit darker down here on your background. I don't know if it needs to be so light everywhere. It also might help to obscure some of the edges and soften some of the contrast with the wheel, because I have a feeling it's detracting a little bit from the rest of it. And then another thing is I might consider doing a little bit kind of softer bloom around him. You've got some really crisp edges against with some really high contrast, and that stuff can work occasionally, but it can also look a little out of place if it's just too crisp. Usually if you're looking at a dark object against a bright sky, there's going to be a little bit of bloom just naturally. Even your eyes are going to pick that up. It's not just a camera thing. And so you might get some softening around the edges there, which will help it feel like it's really, really bright behind him. All right, let's see how that's looking. Yeah, that's fixing some of the things that I saw with this. I think the values are a little bit stronger now, and I think he holds together a bit better. Yeah, so just a few thoughts. Obviously, I'm not getting into the drawing and stuff of the figure. I think it's overall pretty good, but maybe there's some tweaks there. But I'm also not as comfortable as I'd like to be with my own figure drawing and stuff like that. So I'm not quite at the place to get into a deep critique of that stuff yet. But overall, I think that kind of shows off what I'm trying to do there. So yeah, hopefully that helps. Any tips for values with lighter materials? Yeah, I think you're doing actually a quite good job. I think for the most part, I really like how subtle it is. You might bring in more of the sky color though. I think that's part of what's lacking, is that you've got, you're kind of imitating a really, really blue sky here, and yet you go fairly gray with most of your shadow values. And so it might be nice to get some more of those kind of blue tones in there. Don't forget that the whole thing's also being lit by all that blue sky. So yeah, bringing in some more blue tones would be really nice. But I like what you're doing overall. I just think it needs a few of those hits of like extreme dark. So yeah. So yeah, that's about all I'll do on that one. But it's looking good. I really like it. It's just a few thoughts. All right. This is cool. Just gonna take a look for a second. So let's see here. There's a few things I'm seeing off the bat. I think the first one is actually a composition thing, and it's to do with this center island. It's the fact that excuse me, I can't exactly tell where it is in space, and that's partially a perspective thing, but it's also partially a composition thing, that it's not overlapping enough things. There's not a lot of overlap going on in this piece, and I think that's one of the main problems I'm seeing. So, excuse me. Wow, I'm not used to this much talking. So like this rock over here, it's not overlapping kind of anything. It's not overlapping the water. It's not overlapping, the sky or anything. And same goes for a lot of these other rocks. There's not a lot of overlap going on. And so this center one isn't overlapping much. It's overlapping this bottom area, but that's not giving us much context for where it is or anything like that. So I think overlap is the first thing I'd talk about, and then also perspective. The perspective feels a little bit weak in a few places. So let's see what we can do to fix some of those things. So one thing I want to do is I want to start tying in this center rock with the foreground. So I'm going to do that by actually extending some stuff and giving us kind of context for where it is in space. And this will also be an excuse to work on some of the perspective to really get this feel of this coming forward to us. So we've got some pretty extreme perspective here that's kind of being implied, and I want to see you go like way stronger with that. So really make sure you've got that grid down there and you're paying attention to all your forms, and that as things get above this horizon line, that you're not ever looking at you're not ever looking down at them. You're always looking up at that stuff. So for instance, you probably wouldn't see this much of the green grass and stuff on these upper ones. I will say I really like the colors you've got going on here. I think they are very cool. Oh, and same goes for perspective on these clouds. So you've got these wispy clouds, and so this is a perfect time to emphasize the perspective of the whole piece by giving us a little bit of depth up there in the sky and showing that how that sky is really coming up and towards us. Oh, and be sure you think about like where you're putting these light values. So you've got like pinks here on top, but the sun's over here. So think about like where that's coming from. If this is a ball right here, it's going to be kind of lit sort of on the side. There's a little bit of course, like distortion going on from the really wide perspective, but you're definitely not going to get the pinks kind of on the top like that. You would for like a little bit of backlighting, but that's going to look a little bit different than what you've got. So realistically, I think you're going to get more pinks on the side here. So always just thinking about those simple 3D forms. And try to get a little bit simpler with your values. Don't mix them up quite so much. Really get clear shapes, like stick to a smaller value range. Because if you're getting too much contrast within these objects, you're going to start breaking up the clarity of this scene. So here, just by like simplifying this whole cloud here, like it all starts to tie together, and then suddenly it's a much clearer shape, and you got this overall feel of this cloud. So as you're getting objects that are sort of getting close to being right in front of the sunset, make sure to move those kind of to a silhouette almost. You're not going to see much of the light on them anymore, so you're only going to get the light on the sides of objects like this as they get away from the sun. As they get closer and closer to the sun, they're actually just going to be straight up backlit, which means that all we're going to get from them is pretty much just a silhouette. And so that's going to simplify these shapes back here. All right, so I think that's some of the main stuff I wanted to talk about on this one. Actually, I did that all in one layer, so I can't show you the original again. But hopefully, if you go back and compare this to what you've got, you'll start to see some of what I was doing. But hopefully that makes sense. It's pretty simple stuff, but those little tiny tweaks make a huge difference. And so thinking about more the overlap, making sure the perspective is just spot on, and then thinking about kind of simplifying and clarifying some of your values and colors, so they're not getting too out of whack. So, yeah. Let's see here. Do I have any plans of a higher paid tier for some one-on-one critique? Yeah, I would be interested in doing that. I just haven't, not for the time being, just because I'm more interested in trying to help a lot of people, and I know my one-on-one critique stuff would have to be pretty expensive for me to justify doing it. So maybe at some point, but not yet. So. All right. So here we go. All right, this is sweet. Let's see here. Just like to take a look at things. I think again, this is kind of a value thing. That's what I'm going to be talking about. I like a lot of what's happening with the subtle value range of the background here, of the wing and stuff like that. I think that's working fairly well. I wonder... Alright, let me try some stuff. So you can see I'm starting to try to figure out how I want to simplify these values. I'll try something a little different here. Let's see here. So anytime I'm doing a piece, I'm always thinking about light shapes and dark shapes and making sure that I can unify those and make them as simple and readable as possible, and making sure there's not too much, light in the dark areas that I've got, nor dark in the light areas that I've got. I want to really clarify that stuff. So when I've got a light value, I want to keep it mostly light. And so I'm going to see if I can break this down in such a way that I can clarify these value shapes. Because yeah, I think the overall impression I'm getting of this piece is there's kind of too much contrast everywhere. And I'd like to see more kind of restraint with the contrast in most of the areas. Because that'll let you really be strong with some contrast in other areas. So I'm actually gonna, especially for like faces and skin, you can actually get really subtle with keeping all these values in a much tighter range. And same goes for hair. Maybe try grouping a little bit more. Because right now you've got a lot of extreme lights right next to extreme darks, and I think that's what's giving it the kind of choppy look that you've got going on right now. And so I think that's gonna be one of the main things I'm gonna try to fix here. Like for instance, this ear back here, like you've got, all the way from an extreme highlight to an extreme dark, and you probably don't need to. Like it's not a focal point, it doesn't need to be a high contrast thing. And so I wonder about simplifying some of those shapes back there and trying to bring it together. This is obviously a very rough painting job, but I just kind of want to more show the principle of it. Like for instance, on all these little grooves here, you're going, again, full contrast from extreme light to extreme dark, and you can probably get away with unifying some of those lights a little bit more. So when they've got the dark lines running through them, they don't need to be quite quite so dark. And you really want to save your extreme highlights and extreme darks for only where you really want them. And that'll make it a lot more punchy and dramatic, so that when you do have those like really strong darks, it stands out. Because right now you've got a lot of values that are kind of pushing almost towards black, and that's kind of killing some of the sense of light that I think you could have in this piece. It's like, yeah, even though it's dark and it's fire lit, you can still get away with a lot of simplification and a lot of kind of keeping the value range a little bit more restrained. People always assume that to get dramatic lighting, you've got to do dramatic contrast, and they think you've got to do dramatic contrast everywhere. But really, you can get away with a lot of subtlety in a lot of places, and then being very selective with where you end up using those areas of contrast. And yeah, be careful anytime you find yourself doing really thin rim lights as the main source of light. It's usually a sign that either you can just get rid of it and just deal with maybe the dark shape, which I think is what you could probably do here. Yeah, so that's starting to get somewhere. I like it more because once you kind of bring these values up to an easier range, then you can start bringing back in some of those dark areas and using them selectively to make things pop and give that full value range. You just want to be a little bit more careful, especially with those extreme darks. Use them sparingly. Yeah, because my thing is always, zoom out as far as you can and get a look at the piece then. And does it still read as strong? Can you still clarify the light and the dark? And that's the thing you're going for. I'm big on easy readable images. So what do you need to simplify? What do you need to break down? What needs to be a light shape, a dark shape? And make sure it really stays like that. Because it's so easy when you're getting into detail work to lose sight of some of that stuff. And yeah. So yeah, this isn't the most profound Paintover by any means, but I hope it's kind of getting across what I'm talking about here of maybe try like simplifying some of your values. Think of like all of the skin tone is basically one value to start with, and then bring it, to another value for the shadow, and really think about those big shapes rather than exactly what things are and how to render each individual thing, because that's kind of the impression you're conveying right now. is this sort of really piecemeal approach to the piece, where you're rendering each individual object, which makes everything feel a little too in focus, and everything has the full value range right now. And you probably don't need to have that. You're thinking more about, all right, what's the overall impression that I want to get? I also just want to throw, just real quick, some highlights in her eyes, because I think that'll help too. So yeah, overall, really cool, but just a few thoughts on how to approach some future pieces. Hopefully that stuff makes sense. All right, cool. Another character piece. This is looking cool. There's actually going to be some of the same stuff going on here. So thinking about shapes and how to clarify things and how to make them pop. So for this, again, let's think about, all right, we want to make this head read, and right now it's not really popping, and to some degree that's fine, but I feel like you want a little bit more readability back there. So even if it's just ever so slightly taking like a mid-tone value here and putting it behind this figure, just like you've got the lights lower down in the piece. Because if you find yourself ever using rim light to like define a form, like if the rim light wasn't there, it wouldn't be that defined, you have to be a little bit careful, because there's a chance that you're using that as a cop-out for not paying enough attention to your values. So think about putting maybe a light shape behind something instead. So now we can start thinking about, all right, well, if you're going to have a little bit of light, maybe some sort of diffuse lighting coming down, let's give it a little bit of color. And then I think about the contrast on the face. Again, you can kind of keep it a little bit closer in value range. Try not to go too far overboard with contrast in the face. It can really throw off the whole structure of the face, because I actually think you've got a lot of nice stuff going on in here. You just have way too much contrast. And it's spilling out and kind of throwing off the overall forms that you want to get in the face. So there, just by like blowing out a lot of the stuff that you had and kind of just converting a lot of it into a big light shape, you start to get a better feel for this. And then be careful with the kind of area under the nose, and make sure you're not getting too contrasty there either. That can kind of give a weird like mustache look that you might not want. And then also be sure to bring in some nice hard edges where you can. So like here, defining the under eye, you can start to get some lights in there. And then think about the fleshy pad above the eye, and how that kind of comes up and meets the eyebrow. And so you can actually get some lights in there as well. And then if you add just like a little bit more contrast in here, suddenly you get some areas that really pop. So you can see just in painting there, I've suddenly made too much contrast and too many hard edges. So I'm going to take a little soft brush here and soften some of that stuff out. You can see that's starting to read a bit better. And then I think I would bring in just maybe, maybe bring in some of this nice cool colored lighting and actually bring that onto the face. So like you could add a couple highlights in here that are showing off this cool colors. So right now the face has gotten quite warm overall. I think bringing in some of that coolness would be kind of nice to see. You might also think about maybe doing a little bit of underlighting here. You've got a lot of artificial light going on in this scene, and you could definitely get away with adding in some colored underlighting. Just a thought. I also wonder if maybe the features on the face are a little small. I'm not going to get into that, but that's another thing to think about. The rest is reading fairly well. Yeah, it's pretty much holding together. Yeah, that's the main stuff. Yeah, I think just getting that head to pop was the main thing, and starting to add a little bit more light and form back in there. So obviously I could paint a face for hours, but hopefully that kind of gets across the point of what I'm suggesting you go for here. But generally just a lot more subtlety and keeping those values a little bit closer. Avoiding too much contrast. You don't want too much contrast in a face, especially not kind of soft, because then it just kind of looks like dark. Yeah. So cool. Hopefully that helps. All right, got another landscape here. This is cool. The thing I'm going to suggest first is perspective. Really make sure you've got a perspective grid, and really make sure you know exactly where that horizon line is. So I'm just going to ballpark, and we're going to go ahead and assume that the horizon line's about there. So I'm going to actually make that on a new layer, and that's now our horizon line. And so I want to make sure that the stuff coming off of that is all receding correctly, because right now these rocks, which presumably in real life are supposed to be the same size, are visually still the same size, as in the foreground rocks that are closer to us are the exact same size as the ones that are farther away from us, and obviously they're supposed to be receding. So let's make sure that maybe we make these a little bit bigger. And these a little bit smaller. And also thinking like, okay, as they get farther away, we're going to be seeing them more side on, which means we're actually going to see less of them, because the grass is going to be growing up underneath them and obscuring some of that bottom to them. And then thinking about this, the oval of this pond here, and making sure again that that's making sense in perspective. Just a note, if you are ever trying to make a circular pond in perspective, any circular shape, it's actually going to be a perfect oval. It's actually going to be just as round on one side as the other. And there's reasons for that, or you can just accept that that's pretty much true. as long as your horizon line isn't like tilted or anything like that, it's going to be basically the same. So now let's also think about making sure this reflection here lines up correctly. So just thinking about it mirroring down like that. It'd be careful like blurring your foregrounds too much. It's an effect that can work, but it can also be a little bit of a cop-out. I'd encourage you, at least for the time being, to really try to paint your foregrounds. Even though they're hard, I'd suggest trying that out and seeing if you can do that, and try to find ways to integrate them into the midground there. Also be careful about hugging too close to the borders. It's kind of a common thing with foregrounds that people tend to do, is they just want to keep things safe, so they keep them kind of all along the edge like that. But don't be afraid to let a little bit of that foreground go and let the midground actually just sneak off the edge of the canvas like that. Be a little bit more careful with texture brushes. Don't use too many of them. Sometimes they're okay, but they can kind of cause some lazy habits, where instead of thinking about, all right, I'm going to figure out how to paint a bush, use a foliage brush, and then you're done. So think about that stuff as well. And I'm always thinking about, all right, where's that horizon line, and how are each of these objects relating to it? How far down am I looking at these rocks here in the foreground, for instance? Whereas these that are much farther away, I'm seeing them much more side on, so I'm not seeing too much of the top of them. All right, so that's looking pretty good. Now let's think about maybe some of the distant stuff going on and the clouds. So the clouds are actually going to relate to our horizon line as well. It's okay if we're kind of up in the clouds, which I guess is sort of what you're shooting for here. So I'm actually going to simplify a lot of the stuff you've got. And then try to clarify what these clouds are doing. And maybe start to imply maybe some background back there, because it's sky, but it's not quite sky. And so maybe we can have, kind of looks like we're almost above some of the clouds here. So why not have some distant mountains as well? So I'm just going to quickly sketch in a few mountains. And suddenly that gives even more depth here, because now you've really got a lot of distance that you're looking back into. And then you can have some of those clouds even interacting with the mountains there, going behind them, resting on top of them, obscuring some of them, stuff like that. I would say for clouds to definitely do some more cloud studies. Clouds are really hard to make up, and they have a lot more form and color and values than anyone assumes. So even if you have good like cloud brushes and stuff, you've got to know sort of what's happening with them. And so I would take a look at doing some cloud studies. But yeah, they are hard, and it's going to take a while to get them just right. So going back to some of the other stuff we've been thinking about. So this is a case where I want to clarify the silhouette. And so it's kind of a light value on a light value. So I'm just going to make that now a dark value so that it stands out against the light value behind it. So that's what I'm always thinking about when I'm working, is light values on dark values, dark shapes on light shapes, just always thinking about how can I contrast it to make it read better. So I'm going to turn that off for a second. And then I'm going to make sure this water is a little bit more related to what's above it. So I'm going to bring in some of that white from the clouds. Cool. So that's probably about how much I'll do on this one. So you can see some of those fixes that I did. So really making sure I get that sense of perspective going on. That's a huge thing that'll just make all your landscapes just way better. Making sure you got that strong grasp of perspective. And then, yeah, working on some of the clouds and background stuff, making the foreground a little bit crisper and make sure it doesn't just wrap around the composition like that. So hopefully that stuff makes sense. All right, sweet. So this is cool. I like this a lot. This is cool. Trying to think here. I like this a lot. You've got obviously this really strong, chunky painting style going on here. And I think for the most part, it's working. You know, for a lot of it, it's not necessarily what I would pick because I like things to be a little bit more unified, and I'm always talking about, you know, not having too much local contrast in areas where they don't need it. And so I wonder if you can get some of that reined back in, and then I also think a little bit stronger perspective and form is going to be helping here. So let's see what I can do here. So for instance, when I'm talking like lowering the contrast, like I don't think you need high contrast back here, for instance. Like I think these darks can be way lighter because it's not the focal point tree. And so you can bring these values together and then you can get away with like your really high contrast brush strokes there. This really crisp, different colors here, as long as you keep them in a really tight value range. And I think that's going to be one of the things that I'm going to suggest, is that you can get away with a lot of this stuff if you keep this value range just tighter. So let me try a couple things here. So this is one of my favorite unifying tricks, is a lighten layer, and then you do it very gently, so you don't want to go overboard with it, but you take a nice subtle value and slowly airbrush some things back, and it can really help to unify some of your values when they're getting too contrasty. So this is one I do to my own paintings all the time. When I see that I'm getting kind of off track and I've got too much contrast everywhere, this is one of the tricks that I'll pull out. And I'm not going to blow it out quite as much as I would on, like, for instance, my own piece. Because I think partially the crispness that you've got going on here is part of what's working for you, and I don't want to actually take that all away. I'm just going to do a little bit of this. Start to bring it together. Yeah, so it removes a little bit of that kind of visual noise and lets you bring the focus exactly where you want it. So the other thing I want to talk about is some of the perspective, and I think that could be a bit stronger in areas. So yeah, like for instance, this path, it stays visually kind of the similar size. Like the width of the path back here isn't that much different than it is here. It gets a little bit bigger in the last little bit, but not that much. And so I wonder, let's make it a little bit tinier back here. And then let's think about actually making it quite a lot bigger up here in the foreground. Let's let this foreground like really come forward, because it feels a little bit tentative as it is. And so let's actually extend some of this stuff. And suddenly you've got a lot more depth in the piece, just by having that little bit. And obviously if you're going to do that, you might want to make sure that this hut here also has that similar sense of perspective. I might also avoid some of the blacks that you've got going on in there, and instead actually add a little bit of value range so that we can see a little bit more of what's going on. Like maybe we can see a doorway in here. That'd be kind of fun. You know, even if it's really subtle, it adds just a little extra story element to it. And think about shapes here as well. So think about this as, all right, I'm going to make it a whole dark shape. In that case, put a light shape behind it so that I can actually make it stand out. You know, you can have it blend in a fair bit on both sides, but if you get just a couple of the edges such that they're really popping out, then suddenly it's like, oh shoot, yeah, I can see what that is. So think about those shapes. And you might consider, I don't know if it's going to work or not, but you might consider making some of the flowers also a little bit closer to us. Yeah, so I kind of like that. It's a little bit of a different take on things, but yeah. So cool. Those are just some thoughts. Hopefully that stuff makes sense. I tried to keep like the spirit of the piece that you had, but some ways to take what you've got going on here with your style and approach and just push it like a little bit further, make it a little bit more visually appealing. But I like what you've got, and hopefully this stuff helps. All right, sweet. This is cool. I like a lot about this. Let's see here. Just trying to think for a minute. I think my big thing for you is going to be three-dimensional form. You've got a strong sense of the two-dimensional look of things, and for the most part that's working for you. But a lot of stuff is lacking a sense of really three dimensions, and I'm going to see if I can kind of show you what I mean by that. So let's take I'm just going to dive in and start adding some form to things. So partially it's going to be like a lack of perspective on things, and partially it's going to be lack of attention to like the individual small forms. So I like what you've got going on here in the foreground. I think that's kind of a nice example of the sort of form we want to see. where each of these is pretty carefully observed and you're really thinking about it, and you can really feel like, okay, that's the depth. But as you start to get back from that, you lose some of that sense of depth and form. So I want to see if we can get some of that back. So really getting in there and thinking about, okay, what's this form doing? Okay, let me have some dark on the other side, light, and I'm going to have this form, and it's going to go up like this. And then thinking about each of these brushstrokes, like, okay, you're going to have this one go up, and then it's going to overlap with another thing in front of it. And getting a little bit more deliberate with some of your brush work. You're getting a bit scribbly for the sake of scribbly, and you want to make sure that you're really paying attention to what you're doing, and really get deliberate with stuff. Like, okay, you've got this rock shape here, and then it's going to come down like this, and then you can have some snow kind of snaking in there. And have another layer maybe behind it. So really start to get specific. So even in that little tiny area there, you can start to see that these are getting more like three-dimensional form, and a lot of it's coming about by, overlapping these shapes on top of shapes, and just getting really, really specific about what's happening, rather than trying to keep it kind of vague, because you've got the right sort of colors and lighting, but some of the edges and some of the forms and the actual drawing of what's going on is leaving us without something to kind of latch our eyes onto, because we don't know exactly what we're looking at because you haven't spelled out enough things. Like, our eyes can fill in a lot of details, but you need to give us just enough to get us going, and there's not enough going on back here where you have actually really deliberately been like, okay, here's this rock, here's this other overlapping thing with snow on it, here's exactly how that works. So we don't have enough of that to make assumptions about the rest of it. So. But I like the colors, I like the lighting. Same goes for the clouds. I think the clouds could use a bit more form. Like, you've got a lot of nice implied forms up here, but I want to see a little bit more decisive brushwork where you're really deciding, like, okay, this is going here, this is the exact shape of this. It can be kind of easy to fall into a pattern of, I can imply things well enough, so I don't need to make the actual decisions. But try to actually really decide, like, okay, this is exactly what this cloud looks like, and I'm going to get some really crisp edges in there, and that's what it's going to be. So yeah, I really like a lot of what you're doing in here, and I think a lot of it's working. But yeah, I think it's just a little bit of that extra clarity of form. You might consider something that helped me a lot with that is actually getting in and doing some line drawing. I'm not much of a line artist. It's not something I'm known for, but I do find that it's a nice balance to my tendency, just like you, with kind of thinking more about the flat shapes, more about like the actual painting aspect of it, and getting back to, okay, let me think about how does this actually work? What am I really trying to paint here? and it makes you make those clear choices. So I might consider suggesting that. And I think it might help. It definitely helped me a lot when I really needed to drill down and like, okay, what am I actually making here? So yeah, hopefully that helps. So, but really nice stuff. Right. So let's turn that on and off. So just some tiny tweaks, but I think all your colors and lighting and stuff like that are spot on. So just a little bit more form and depth. All right, so got some thumbnail stuff. These are looking cool. I like these. Obviously there's not going to be as much to say on this as some of the more like finished stuff. But I do want to talk about a couple things. So I really like this one. I think this actually has like a lot of potential. Especially if you were to like, so I'm assuming this is like a foreground dead tree and then city in the background and then this in the far, far background. I think if you bring your value range a little bit further, it might help. I also might consider losing some of the stuff here at the top. I'm always hesitant to have any tree that goes up along the side. This is something that I talk about in art camp, and it's so often just, it doesn't work quite like people want it to. And I get why people do it. And the thing that I would do is actually add like maybe a couple trees back in there. And then you can add maybe some foliage here. And I think that kind of breaks it up a little bit more. Because yeah, there's something about just those compositional shapes that just like wrap around the side of a composition that just don't work for me. I think it's a little bit more than like a pet peeve. I think it's actually just that it's something I've noticed. But I do like that composition. You know, of course, always add like a little figure sitting there, sitting on the dead tree. So, but yeah, I like it. It's cool. I think that has quite a lot of potential. I like the idea of like painting this like gnarly like uprooted tree with like this huge root ball and stuff. I think that'd be a lot of fun. So yeah, these are cool. All right, so we have a couple of variations here. Yeah, I like these. I'm gonna go ahead and talk about the one on the left. I think that's my preference. I like some of the, like I like his little face tentacle shapes over here better than I do over here. They feel a little bit stronger. And I like this kind of warm, cool stuff going on. So yeah, I'm gonna poke around on this one. So right off the bat, I'd say you've got way too much like dark to black, and it'd be nice to get in something else. So let's bring in a little bit more mid-tone. I'm also not sold on this foreground rock here for now. I'm all about foregrounds, but I'm not sure if that's doing what you want it to do. And then I also want to bring in a little bit more cool tones in here. So I wonder if it needs like some cool mist at the bottom or something. And then start to, whatever your kind of cool ambient light source is, start to use that to show us some of that form. And be careful with rim light, again, of just not thinking about the form and just, painting the kind of same width rim light. Realize that rim light's really just a light source that happens to strike some things at a really severe angle, but other things it's probably going to catch a lot more light on. So you can actually get some of that light to actually come in the face a bit more. So yeah, just a little bit of a stronger sense of light. I also like the idea of, having some other stuff going on, like whether you want, more of these dudes around or whatever it is. Especially if you're gonna crop the figure like this, it can be kind of fun to have some places where you get to show off more of the figure, more what they look like. And that would also let you do some fun stuff with the background of adding some more of these torches. And then, yeah, I'd like to get a little bit lighter values going on in here so I can kind of see what's going on. Like, I know I'm in a fairly bright room right now, but still it's pretty darn dark in there. And it might be nice to get a little bit more light in there. And just like I've been saying on other people and their work, think about getting some more of those like big light shapes and big dark shapes and make those really obvious. So if you look at like Golden Age illustrators and stuff, they're wonderful at grouping their light shapes and their dark shapes into these big, strong, dramatic shapes. And that's what gives their work so much of the solidity that it has. So quite a lot more light to it, but hopefully that kind of makes sense on what I would do to that. Just really emphasize that light. Like if you're gonna have a dude holding a torch, like have a dude holding the torch. Like don't just kind of be weak with the lighting. Really get in there and get the lighting right, and obviously get some reference or something. Something to really show off, like, okay, this is what really dramatic rim light actually does to a figure, and you can get some really good intensity going on. But yeah, I really like it. I think it's off to a sweet start. I think it could turn into a really, really cool piece. So cool, that's actually all the pieces for today. So yeah, that was fun. Thanks for everybody that submitted their piece. This was a lot of fun. It was great getting to do some paintovers like this. I'm definitely going to have to do this more. I think it's really useful for everybody, whether your piece is getting critiqued or not. And it's a lot of fun. I think it's kind of cool to see the transformation of a piece in a relatively short amount of time. And I know I've said this on another stream at some point recently, but this is actually kind of the same mindset I will take on my own stuff when I'm feeling stuck with it. Is I will take it and try to treat it like a piece that I'm seeing for the first time, and I'm doing a quick paint over on it and try to solve problems that way. So if somebody handed me a piece, this is how I would fix the problems. And it can be really nice to look at your own stuff in that way, where you're trying to just fix something without being, so invested and so emotionally attached to it. Because, I haven't done any work on these pieces. It's great. I haven't spent the hours and hours, and I'm not super invested in how it looks right now. Rather, I can kind of step back from it and be like, oh yeah, you should just completely eliminate this whole thing and change this whole thing, because you're not invested in it like that. So getting to step back from like that is really handy. So I think that'll about do it for today. I'm not sure when I'm going to do my next one, but I will hopefully try to book that sometime. I'm going to do them sporadically, I guess. Yeah, but other than that, I'm going to still, of course, be in the Discord and chatting and trying to give help where I can. So yeah, thanks again for everything, and I will see you guys next time.